I asked my grandmother once about her most memorable fashion moment, and she described to me this girl who came to a soiree in rural Belarus in a full circle skirt, they'd call it a sun skirt, and how it was incredibly glamorous, not only because this amount of fabric was so hard to come by, but also how the girl looked absolutely luminous. This image stayed with me, the way your movement changes in a skirt like that, it transforms you somehow. It doesn't have to be in this vintage mold though, it doesn't have to sit on the waist, depending on the fabric, on the styling you choose, it can be very versatile. I genuinely think that a full voluminous skirt looks great on anyone, despite all of these ballet princessy associations. It's a very wearable, timeless garment. It's great for summer because it's breezy, it gives great isolation in winter when worn with several garments underneath. And I'm going to talk about length and proportions later. In its essence, it's a circle, it's very easy to make. As usual, the devil is in the details. I have a method for very nice pockets in particular. I'm going to show you those, and you'd obviously need quite a bit of fabric. Now for a big voluminous skirt, first of all, I think you have to consider the weight. A long one like I'm making would need roughly 2 square meters, and it usually states how much a square meter weighs when you buy your fabric. Just so that you have an idea, a pair of jeans usually weighs about 1 kilogram. Artificial fibers are very tempting here because they can be very light and cheap, but as usual, I find it just makes sense to invest time and money and energy into something of high quality that can breathe, that you'd love, and that will love you back for a long time. I got my hands on this silk and this linen, and I intend to sew a few staples out of these, a few different skirts, a jacket maybe, which this is part of a series, by the way. I want to build a whole wardrobe from scratch, just a handful of garments that fit me and my everyday life, match each other, and are suited for several occasions, a personal uniform so to speak. Although this fabric drapes and looks a bit like a woolen tweed, it is silk. It's called bourrette silk. It is essentially made from silk waste, and these waste fibers are rather short. That's why the bourrette yarn has this sort of woolen, slightly coarse grip to it, yet it still has that typical subtle silky sheen as well. Wool obviously drapes nicely, and there certainly are wools that you can wear in summer, but my skin gets extremely sensitive when it's a bit damp, and especially wool can be a bit prickly. So for this set of clothes, I really wanted for it to be wearable all year round, and the silk, it's extremely soft on the skin. I guess you can consider it a downside. Bourrette silk can have some noticeable bumps and knots and irregularities, especially on the wrong side, kind of like typical wild silk. I'm going to make the same skirt out of this linen, and on that note, consider how stiff you want for your skirt to be. A light, soft fabric would fall and drape, while a stiff fabric would sort of stick out and appear somewhat wider, more voluminous at the bottom. Because of the material, but also because of the weave, this silk almost doesn't wrinkle, or rather it gets back in shape very quickly, which is definitely something that should be considered when making a voluminous skirt like that, unless you really enjoy pressing stuff. Linen, on the other hand, wrinkles when you just look at it, but I guess it's also part of its charm. However, it's also rather strong. This bourrette silk is woven relatively tight. It is a twill weave. You can recognize it by this diagonal structure. And twills, they tend to be rather strong, durable, perfectly ideal for the type of garments that get external wear and tear, like skirts, trousers, jackets. And well, I really respect people who are very careful and meticulous with their clothes. I can get quite pedantic with how I care for and wash those, but when I'm out and about, I just can't be bothered. I like to sit on grass or some random steps on the street. I bike. I have a dog who likes to sit on my lap. Minor stains are kind of inevitable. This skirt would obviously have plenty of surface to get dirty, and I want for it to be for everyday wear. I want for it to last as long as possible. So for me, it was important that the fabric would have some sort of texture, or better yet, would have some sort of woven pattern, which can be quite forgiving. Stains, repairs, mendings are just less noticeable that way. They can be better concealed than on a smooth surface. However, aligning these can be a bit tricky, so I chose to film the skirt out of this fabric to show you how I deal with that. Actually, it can be really frustrating when you're looking for something particular. This is a woven Pepita. I've seen many people, even in the industry, confuse these weaving patterns. So many refer to this as houndstooth. And to be honest, specialty books by experts about weaving techniques and patterns are extremely expensive, and they also give conflicting or vague information. But from what I gathered so far, and according to my source, this is the OG houndstooth pattern, while this is a combination of the Pepita and houndstooth pattern, and since roughly the 19th century it's commonly referred to as houndstooth pattern. However, it was initially called Vichy pattern, which is something entirely different than the Vichy check or gingham. As you can see, they are all slightly different, however, more often than not, they are all just called houndstooth. And to be fair, from a distance, they look rather similar. Then there are also variations and combinations of different patterns combined into bigger overchecks, the most recognizable one being the gland check probably. Obviously colors also affect how these patterns are perceived and also add another layer of symbolism or alternative names. My silk also has these larger overchecks created by color, however the pattern itself, as you can see, it's not broken into checks. So if we strictly talk about only the pattern without the colors, you can see how these small checks are not broken up into shapes, so it looks much more checkish than what we call houndstooth. Okay, this is getting ridiculous. Anyway, it is assumed that these checked twill patterns originated from the traditional woven tweed cloth in Scottish lowlands. And there's an incredible, beautiful, rich history with different patterns and colors that are also often linked to different clans, which I'm not going to get into today. But this pattern, Pepita, the shepherd's check, it is also commonly referred to as Falkirk tartan. And in fact, the earliest documented tartan-like cloth in Britain is known as the Falkirk tartan. A fragment was found near the Antonine Wall. It is thought to have been buried there about 260 AD in a jar along 2000 Roman coins. Surviving pre-modern examples seem sparse outside of northwestern Europe, but obviously we can assume that similar patterns of rectangles and lines have independently occurred in other cultures as well, and also sometimes maybe been adopted and fused with local techniques post-European contact. In Western fashion, tartan patterns became gradually popular since roughly the 19th century. It obviously goes hand in hand with Romanticism and later Historicism, which was all about longing for and searching for and idolizing the heroic past and folklore. The Victorian era is notorious for tartan mania, a time when Highland culture was also strongly appropriated. But overall, in fashion for patterns, and especially in men's fashion, what we consider to be classic tailored suits, ever since the great masculine renunciation, we see a decline in non-abstract, figurative, floral patterns. That doesn't mean those vanished completely, but they are starting to be perceived as whimsical almost, mostly reserved for semi-hidden layers like vests, linings and socks, which they arguably still are in classic tailoring. While anything abstract like stripes, checks, tartans are, I guess, austere enough for the outer shell as well. And ever since, tartans, houndstooth, Pepita became part of classic British tailoring, which was emulated all over the world and adopted into female fashion as well. And when I say classic, I mean the less formal sort of classic, because these patterns, they do have an aura of leisure. And while Pepita can be found in women's wear, I think there's an almost grey area there, because I'd say it's mostly what we call houndstooth that is considered to be feminine. Dior famously loved incorporating houndstooth patterns in his designs. Chanel also certainly contributed to this association. A bit closer to us, the Horn of Plenty collection definitely left an impact on fashion, where Alexander McQueen exaggerated, I guess almost mocked Dior's classical glamorous designs, which adds another layer to it, since Lee Alexander McQueen obviously had Scottish roots and has referenced the legacy of Scotland's romanticization and the concealment of its traumatic history, most notably in his infamous collection Highland Drape. I also read somewhere that it gives great camouflage for stalking sport, as in hunting. And speaking of camouflage, Pepita in black and white is also commonly used for chef's trousers. In German, chef's or baker's trousers are literally called Pepita Hose because, and here we're going full circle, because it's really good at concealing stains. So the pattern itself is a simple circle with another circle at the center, and this can be your hip measurement or your waist measurement depending on where you want for your skirt to sit. So you have to measure that. All of this then falls down and creates beautiful volume. If that's not enough volume for you, you can even create a skirt out of several circles. Then you'd have to divide your waist measurement between those and connect them to each other, creating a huge sort of ruffle all around your waist. I like to break up my circle into 3 pieces so that I can have side seam pockets here and a zipper at center back. If your fabric is wide enough, you can also cut it out directly and add an opening wherever you want. You just have to make the inner radius bigger, meaning you'd need to add to your waist measurements so that once you cut, you'll have seam allowance for your opening. If you have a pattern that works both ways and a nice selvage, I would position my pieces like that on the fabric. Obviously, if you have a distinct pattern that has a top and a bottom, you might want to align your pieces differently to match your vision. To connect these to each other, you will need seam allowance here and also where the waistband is going to be. Positioning it like that would make the seam allowance the selvage, which is neat because these seams won't need additional finishing and will just look nice on the inside. Now there's not going to be a pattern instruction PDF for the skirt itself because in my experience it's a waste of time, it's a waste of paper. Even if you manage to draft to cut out a perfect circle, some lengths are going to be on bias, so they will droop and you'd need to adjust your hem anyway. So we're going to mark everything directly on the fabric. First we need to find out the radius for the inner circle. And this length here is going to be the length of your skirt. Together, these are going to be the radius for the whole piece. So I'm going to take that and find a position close to the edge of my fabric. I find it helps to lay it out on a carpet so it won't move too much. Also, don't forget to pre-wash your fabric. If you want to be able to wash your garment later, you need to wash it before sewing. Having checks on your fabric can be a blessing and a curse. The linen skirt doesn't have a clear, noticeable pattern, and in comparison, it's an extremely quick affair. With a pattern, you have to take notice of where the center is going to be. I'm going to make this black line the center of mine. Now you can proceed as is. This is a skippable step, a slight alteration to the circleness of it all. But as I mentioned before, I want to be able to wear these garments until I die. Since our bodies obviously change, I want to be able to adjust to ease the waist portion if needed. This is sadly one of those practices that is lost in our fast fashion world, but especially on a circle skirt it can be achieved rather easily. I'm going to simply create pleats here on the front piece next to the side seams. That way I'd be able to open and readjust the waistband and open these pleats if I would need more width at the waist. It obviously goes in the other direction as well. You can certainly add a fold if you'd need to make the waist smaller at some point. So I find the easiest is to simply fold the fabric, maybe press it and quickly baste the fold before cutting. I'm using these checks as a guide for this pleat. The reason I'm not creating this sort of spare width by simply making the inner radius bigger and placing a fold afterwards is because I find it falls a bit more intentional, prettier that way. In this example, I also wouldn't simply add more seam allowance as a sort of reservoir. That will make things exhausting for future me because that's where the zipper and the pockets are, and opening these up is a pain. So like I said, totally skippable, but I will simply treat it now as if it were the whole fabric rather than doing all sorts of geometric exercises. Because the selvage is essentially the seam allowance for me, I'm going to mark the center point of my circle of my skirt here, right where the selvage starts and on the black line I chose earlier. And now because we also need seam allowance for the waistband as well, I'm going to subtract it from the inner radius and mark it on both sides of the black line, and also on the line itself, measured from the center point of course. To mark the small circle you can just use a ruler or measuring tape. With the outer circle it gets a bit trickier. Here I also mark the right angles first. In the Pepita it gives a very clear orientation, kind of like a checkered sheet. I pierced my needle through the center point. Here the carpet underneath is also very helpful. My measuring tape has this eyelet, so I'm going to use that, but you can also fashion something with a strong yarn or ribbon. This is the marking for my outer circle, and I'm just going to continue and mark this arc. In my experience, it's not going to be perfect, so don't stress too much about it because we will have to adjust the hem later anyway. The pattern pieces for the back can be cut out in the same manner, but it will be 2/4 essentially. This black line will be the center again. I make sure that the edge correlates with the pattern, with the lines on the front piece, so that there is no dissonance at the side seams. I'm also adding 1 cm seam allowance for the center back, which on this pattern means essentially cutting along the line next to it. And these are the main pieces all cut out. I'd say we mostly associate the silhouette with the 1950s, especially in combination with petticoats. In its way, it actively demonstrates an unbothered, conspicuous consumption. It is very much a collective symbol for the perfectly unhinged nuclear family at this point, as much as the suburbia landscape itself, I'd say. Especially with the petticoat, it had put in extreme dissonance between the silhouettes of the sexes. There's obviously nothing inherently feminine about the silhouette though, but that's a topic for another time. However, before that, in the 1940s, women have adopted a somewhat somber style and silhouette. which in its essence, in its lines, resembled a men's suit. This duality of a jacket and a suit stayed, although the silhouette was drastically changed with the introduction of the infamous new look in 1947. And Christian Dior, he wasn't called the dictator of fashion for nothing. In fact, he established a precise number for his hems, measured from the floor. But I do suggest that you measure it on yourself. Our legs have curves, for some it's more pronounced, for some less so. And it's not about size here, it's really about proportions, because essentially the skirt creates a triangular shape. And with a circle skirt, I find it's most flattering when it ends right where the curve of the legs starts to turn inward. I hope you see what I mean here, but when essentially this big block of volume stops at the wrong height, it can look a bit awkward, a bit unflattering for my taste. In the late 50s, early 60s, the hemline starts to rise, and I don't know, I think it distorts the harmony of the whole silhouette. So this is all my opinion, but the turning inward happens here and here. For a short skirt, I wouldn't use a circle. I think something pleated would be a bit more practical and comfortable, because, you know, they really fly up when you twirl around, which a long skirt can also create a spectacle, but it's just a bit more intentional. You can wear a petticoat underneath. Keep in mind that this would raise the hem a bit as well. So yeah, this is my preferred length, right down to the most prominent width of the calf, and when I cut, I add a bit of wiggle room, about 4 centimeters, just to be sure. Obviously, depending on how much time you want to spend, if it all seems a bit daunting, you can just skip the pockets altogether, shut the side seams close, and be proud and happy with a perfectly beautiful circle skirt. However, a huge skirt like that allows for gigantic pockets, which is great. So at this point, I'm also going to find the position for where I want for my pockets to sit. To have an orientation for the depth of my pockets, I measure where my thumb roughly ends, and also the length where it's comfortable to do this sort of reaching movement. This will be the length of the pocket opening where it's going to be shut in the side seam. And we need to mark the opening on the front and back pieces. Now, I personally do not like it when the pockets are just sewn into the side seam, because depending on how much stuff you carry around, and I mean our phones are literal bricks at this point, it can start to sort of pull on the sides, on the side seams, which is maybe not as noticeable on a full voluminous skirt, but I really prefer when the weight of the pockets is distributed and secured on the waistband as well. As usual, I'm obviously interested in it looking very neat, so you know, might as well give it some extra attention and do it without any extra overlock stitching. There is a free PDF on how to construct the pattern for the pocket lining for this method. Very quick and easy, and I'm going to show it to you step by step. For the lining, it's best to use some sturdy and yet lightweight fabric to not create bulky seams, to not add to the weight of the skirt. I highly advise to stay away from any polyester lyocell stuff. I feel like at this point we all had some type of garment where the pockets started to fray and rip because it is a very unsuitable, very cheap fabric. I usually use very plain, lightweight cotton or some scraps I have lying around. This is the pouch and it's cut on fold. This is the front of my skirt. This is the back piece. The selvage is the seam allowance here to not create additional bulk. For me it's 1 centimeter. And for the pouch itself, the seam allowance is double the width of the selvage all around here. This extra here will be folded under the selvage of the skirt pieces. Now these are going to be inseam pockets, however when you open those the lining may be somewhat visible. You can add an interesting detail to your garment by choosing a contrasting color for your pouch, or however choose a fabric that blends perfectly with your outer fabric. I'm just being nitpicky. You can totally skip this step for an inseam pocket on a voluminous skirt, but I will add a small insert where the opening is. And here, if you have a distinct pattern like mine, you'd have to cut it so that the pattern perfectly matches the pattern on your front piece. And it's going to be stitched onto the side that connects to the back piece. I mark next to it on the lining, on the pouch. As usual, I'm working with 1 centimeter seam allowances here, so this is where the stitch is going to be initially. I also pressed the bottom line here so that this edge can be secured easily as well. Now on the lining, I'm going to mark inwards, so double the seam allowance 2 centimeters away from this line. The insert can be laid next to this line here, and I'm stitching it with the 1 centimeter seam allowance down to the bottom. I press it to the other side and also secure it along the bottom as well. Here you have to pay extra attention that your pattern aligns with the mark for your opening so that it matches the skirt pieces. For me, the marking is right above this black line. And I also secured it here just so that it won't wobble around. Again, totally skippable, but just makes me happy. Anyway, now I'm going to turn it over and place the back piece and the front piece of the skirt right next to this outer line I marked here. All the wrong sides are facing me. Here again, check that your pattern aligns perfectly with the marking for the opening. The side with the insert is going to be connected to the back and the other one to the front. And I'm going to stitch right next to this edge up until that marking, up until the opening of the pouch. Like that. And so that now I can pinch the lining against this edge, against the selvage, so that the raw edge of the lining would be sandwiched in there, on both sides. And I can stitch again with the seam allowance in mind, right up until the marking for the opening. This is what it looks like on the wrong side, here. And this is the other side. Here, these black lines on the insert also match the ones on the skirt. I'm not going to press it just yet. First, I want to connect the side seam. And here again, to match the pattern as best as I can, I will baste it beforehand. Mostly concentrating that these black lines line. I pierce my needle from the line on the one side, right through the black line on the other side. And now I'm going to stitch from here. I pinch the pouch out of the way, also the seam allowances of the pouch. And I start from right here where we left off down to the hem. So, I mean, it's not too bad. Now the pouch itself is obviously open still. There's going to be some French seam action happening here. I turn inside out. The fold is sort of my guide here. And I'm going to stitch it along the edge with the seam allowance that I gave the pouch all around, so 1 centimeter. Right up until maybe 2 or 3 centimeters of the opening. We'll deal with that later. I'm using a rather wide stitch here again. That's obviously a lot of seam allowance for a French seam, but I drafted it like that to not confuse you even further. However, now I can cut it back slightly and turn the pouch over again. And here, like with any other French seam, I'm going to stitch the raw edge close along the same path, starting right from where we left off, from the pocket opening, and I pinched my skirt out of the way here like that. This is the finished pouch. I guarantee this will hold the pouch secure and closed much better than any sort of overlocking. And it's nice inside the pouch and nice and clean on the outside as well. Now I'm going to press it. First, the seam allowance of the side seam can be pressed open. On the back piece, the seam can be pressed open and the seam allowance needs to lie towards the back. The connection to the front piece can be also pressed open first. The seam allowance needs to lie towards the front piece. And then you need to fold the pouch under. And here, an important detail, the outer fabric has to almost curve and roll inward to hide the pouch a bit, so that the lining doesn't impose itself when the pocket is addressed. For this roll to stay in a rolled position for a long time, I secured it with an invisible stitch. Honestly, I don't know what the stitch is called, but the one that's barely visible along the edge. I also basted my side fold and the pouch onto the front piece where it belongs. And last but not least, let me show you these trousers. They lived through 10 years of active wear and tear. This is a stress point, right where the opening starts. So to make these beautiful pockets last as long as possible, I added a narrow zigzag stitch right there. It will also hold this tiny bit of raw edge on the inside here as well. You can secure it with a few hand stitches, but since it's very much hidden and there's also no tension on it at all, I wouldn't worry about it. Like I said, a bit of time, a bit of concentration. The bottom is free to move, the weight will be held by the waistband as well, and not one overlocked stitch inside. I think it's worth the effort, and now I'm going to repeat it on the other side as well. Onto the center back now, where my zipper is going to be. I'm using an inseam zipper, and just so that my videos don't become super repetitive and super long, in my last video I show in great detail there how I insert an inseam zipper. Now I chose the black line to be the center of the seam, and I'm not gonna lie, it took me a few attempts and corrections to make it look decent. I had to open it up and readjust a few times. I also finished the raw edges since there's no selvage here with some bias tape. I cut it from the same fabric as the pocket lining. For pattern alignment, it helped to make markings on the zipper itself where the corresponding lines would be. In hindsight, this was such a stupid idea to make this very narrow, noticeable line the center of the seam. Because it's so narrow, it was almost swallowed inside of the seam fold, so I actually had to stitch almost next to it. You can barely see it on the other side. For you and my future projects, I'd recommend to place seams on less noticeable parts of the pattern, like here maybe. But lucky for me, this will be mostly hidden in the volume and folds of the skirt. Discouraged by the black line fiasco, I didn't know whether I should cut my waistband like this or bias. It got a bit ridiculous, so I decided to sleep on it. I ended up cutting it out in the standard horizontal way. You need strong reinforcement here like this one, especially if the waistband sits rather tight, otherwise it might collapse and create unflattering folds. I also gave it a bit of extra length on one side so that I'd be able to open it up again and readjust to make it wider eventually. Here the alignment also took a bit of time and readjustment. Symmetry is very important here. This bothered me, for example, so I stitched everything with a loose stitch first, opened up certain points to move them around, and stitched it on for real once I was happy. In the back I made this overlapping slightly shorter than I usually would, so that this black line would still be visible and they could mirror each other at center back. I also added some ribbons underneath the waistband here so that it'd be able to hold all of that skirt. Other than that, it's pretty much the same. Again, I showed and explained in detail how I work on waistbands in my previous video. I also added a buttonhole, still practicing, but I think this one turned out a bit better than the previous one, and this extra length is going to hide here on the inside. I'm going to hang it up now. We've had this whole conversation with the bias cut slip dresses, but since you know that these lengths of your garment are on bias, the droop is intense. Here on the diagonals, as you can see. This is what happens with circle skirts, that's why you need to let them rest and droop for at least 2 days before hemming. Now, to even it all out, ideally you would put it on and then find something around your house, a reference for your desired length, and use that as a guide to mark all around to even the hemline while you're wearing the garment. If you work on this kind of projects often though, you might want to invest into something like this. You can adjust this device to your preferred length. There is a compartment for chalk powder in here. It has this atomizer rubber bulb which sprays the chalk through the nozzle onto your garment, and you can just go with it all around to mark the length of your skirt or dress. Very helpful, but definitely not a necessity because obviously all of this takes up space as well. So before we start the whole hemming experience, first things first, this circumference is wider than this one. You can't just simply take, say, 3 centimeters and fold it under like you would do on a regular skirt. I mean, there are ways to work around it. You can pinch your fabric, for example, but I personally also do not like it when the hemline is very noticeable on the outside as well, which is almost inevitable with wider skirts and softer fabrics. And I think the most common, the most elegant method here is to make the hemline very, very narrow. So I'm going to cut it very close to the length I initially decided upon. If you use one of these chalk marker thingies, you can do it yourself, theoretically, although it'll be much quicker with help since you wouldn't have to bend down so that the length won't get distorted. The reason I'm not doing it on a mannequin or on a hanger myself is because on a hanger it would just fall flat, and my curves are also different than the ones on the mannequin. My posture is kind of uneven. All of this obviously affects the length as well, and I wouldn't be able to replicate this questionable trademarked stance with a mannequin. Also, FYI, before I used to own this hem marker, I would go to a local bridal wear boutique and ask them if I could use theirs. They usually have one of these, but again, you'd need help, ideally. I just cut it along the marking, and I'm going to stitch and fold it toward the inside, about 5 or 7 millimeters. You can also use an overlock machine here, it can cut directly for you, and then fold it under and top stitch the edge. That's what I do when it needs to be quick. But this is my time to listen to audiobooks and music, so I really prefer to prolong this sort of monotonous work, and I also like to avoid using the serger if I can help it. I positioned my skirt next to me on a chair so that it'd be easier to sew, so that it won't slide down constantly. I'm stitching with a very wide and loose stitch. The reason I'm not using one of these folding foots and I'm not folding it twice already is because once this first stitch is finished, I am sort of pulling on it to create tension, to shrink the fabric slightly, so that when I fold it again there will be less width in the outer circumference. It might look a bit wavy actually if you skip that. Again, this is one of those steps that makes a huge difference to me. If you're using a serger though, you can also adjust the tension of the overlocked seam, and well, now with the tension I created, it's sort of easier to fold again, to make sure that this edge isn't wrinkled or ruffled. I fold it so that the first stitch would be right at the edge, and I'm sort of shooting for the edge to be right at this part of the machine foot too, so that my hemline would be as narrow as possible. I'm also sewing against the side I pulled on, so that I'd be able to readjust the tension as I go. These little bits that are peeking out are going to be on the inside, but should they be long and annoying, one can also cut them back at a later point. And that's the hemline. Apart from the sudden urge to dance, it also feels like I'm wearing a huge soft blanket. I really like wearing this type of skirts when traveling or in the cinema. Basically everywhere I have to sit for a while. I'm really proud of the way the pockets turned out. Regarding care, as usual, I'm sorry I keep saying this, but it feels like we have cultivated this trend of washing clothes after each wear. But unless my hem has been 6 inches deep in mud, or I've been to a very smoky bar, I wouldn't wash it. Unless there are stains, you can simply hang it next to a window or on the balcony overnight. This fabric also didn't have an allergic reaction to the washing machine. With silks you have to use the gentlest of cycles. Maybe add a bit of vinegar so that the fibers stay shiny and soft. With linen, I think it's common knowledge by now that it's rather easy to care for, and that it also gets softer and better with time after each wash. I am going to make another skirt with pleats and with these thingies next. Bye!